Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting stack of material today.
Yeah, it looks like it. Centered around Doug Casey, I see.
That's right. And it dives into something pretty crucial. The relationship, maybe the tension between your personal wealth and, well, state power.
Okay. A meaty topic. It looks like it draws from economics, geopolitics.
Even philosophy,
Yeah.
actually. It lays out some, let's say, pointed views on where governments might be heading with private assets.
Right. So our goal here, as always,
Is to unpack the main arguments from these sources, pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising bits, so you get a clear picture of what's being said and, what it could mean for you.
okay. Sounds good. Where do we start?
Let's jump right in with the core premise.
All right. So the material really kicks off with this idea. Governments, and they mention Western ones like the UK, US, Canada specifically,
Mhm.
are increasingly moving towards, well, let's call it more aggressive control over citizens' wealth.
And they zero in on one area in particular.
Yes, pensions, something a lot of people are counting on.
Right. So what's the specific concern there?
Well, a key point they highlight is legislation already happening or enabled in the UK. It could allow the government to basically compel private pension funds
Impel them. To do what?
to buy national debt, government bonds, essentially.
Wow. So instead of just, growing for your retirement.
The state could potentially direct where that capital goes.
And the reasoning presented.
The sources suggest these pension funds are seen as these huge, sort of stable pools of capital,
Okay.
and they're described as ripe for patriotic capital redirection. That's the phrase used.
Patriotic capital redirection.
That's
Sounds
not
like a euphemism.
The underlying idea presented is the state needs money, and these savings pools are just convenient.
A convenient target.
Yeah.
And this isn't just some theoretical risk, is it? They mention a historical example.
They do. They point straight to Argentina in 2008.
Ah, the pension fund seizure.
Exactly. It's held up as a kind of chilling precedent, a real-world case where a government facing crisis just stepped in and nationalized private retirement savings.
Okay, so that sets a worrying stage. And Doug Casey's view, as presented here, he thinks this is likely elsewhere.
Yeah, the material suggests he sees this trend as, well, almost inevitable globally.
Why? What's the driving force?
His argument basically is that governments everywhere are under immense financial pressure. They need liquidity, they need cash,
And retirement accounts are?
big, centrally managed pots of money, locked up, relatively easy to access through regulation. Just too tempting to ignore from his perspective.
Which leads right into a quote they pulled out, doesn't it?
It does. It's blunt.
Hmm.
The state needs money. It's got to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is you.
Yokes. Okay, that really frames the perspective here. Assume your assets could be targeted.
That's the core message driving the advice that follows, absolutely.
All right, so if that's the risk assessment, government's getting grabby, especially with pensions. What's the counter? What strategies do the sources recommend for, legally protecting your wealth?
Well, they talk a lot about building what they call a financial plan B.
Plan B.
Okay.
And this isn't shady stuff.
No. The emphasis is on legal structures and diversification. It's about adding layers, reducing your exposure to any one government's actions.
So what kind of layers? Like using corporations?
Exactly. They discuss using corporations, maybe offshore ones, to hold assets.
Like putting your house in a company name.
Yeah, or other real estate investments. The idea is holding it through a legal entity, especially one in a different country, adds complexity. It's not just your name on the deed in your home country.
Right, adds a buffer. What else? They mentioned IRAs.
Self-directed IRAs, yeah. These are retirement accounts where you choose the specific investments, not some big fund manager.
And you can put different things in them.
Correct. Things like physical gold, maybe silver, even foreign real estate. Assets that aren't just numbers in a brokerage account sitting neatly within one country's banking system.
So it's about different types of assets.
And holding them in different ways and places, using legal structures.
Got it. And related to that, they advise caution about big financial institutions.
Yes. The point is, large, centralized banks and brokerages are heavily regulated. They're subject to government mandates, maybe even things like bail-ins.
Bail-ins, where they use depositor money.
Precisely. If a big bank gets into trouble, a bail-in means your deposits could potentially be used to prop it up. So less reliance on these central hubs is part of the strategy.
Okay, that makes sense. Decentralize, diversify assets and structures. They had some analogies for this Plan B, didn't they?
They did. Quite vivid ones, like a scuba diver's backup regulator.
The octopus rig.
Right. Or a skydiver's reserve parachute.
Things you hope you never, ever need.
But if the main system fails, they're lifesavers. The message is clear. Build a backup for your finances because the default system might not be as secure as you assume.
That really drives the point home. Okay, so beyond the financial structures, the material also talks about a geographic plan B.
Yeah, this is a big piece of it. The idea of second residencies, maybe even alternative citizenships.
So having another passport or the right to live somewhere else.
Exactly. The sources argue this isn't just a luxury anymore. With rising political and economic uncertainty.
It becomes a tool for security.
Potentially, yes. For personal freedom and financial safety. It gives you options if things go sideways in your home country.
What examples do they give?
Well, they mentioned Argentina again, interestingly. Apparently, they have a new citizenship by investment program. $500,000 gets you a passport.
That's different from their usual route.
Very. The traditional path required living there for 2 years, and the sources say that's actually become more stringent now, so there's this new pay-to-play option.
And what about the Caribbean options? The so-called passport mills.
The material notes, they're still out there, but they're facing a lot more scrutiny internationally, so maybe less reliable or more complicated than they used to be.
Are there options that don't involve huge investments?
Yes, they mention countries like Uruguay and Mexico. Simply residency paths, apparently, but they generally require you to actually spend significant time living there.
So it depends on your resources, time versus money.
Pretty much. They list others too. Malta, the U.S. Golden Visa, Paraguay, all with different costs, timelines, requirements. It's a whole landscape out there.
And through Doug Casey's lens, as presented here,
Mm-hmm.
how is citizenship itself viewed?
As a life raft.
Not just
Fundamentally.
a ref. Oh,
Yeah, his advice is really direct on this. If you can't afford to buy citizenship somewhere, then invest the time needed to earn residency and eventually citizenship somewhere else.
And if you don't have the time?
Then find a way to get the money. His point seems to be, don't just sit there. Do something. Actively create options for yourself. Don't wait until you're trapped.
That sense of urgency definitely comes through, which I guess leads us into the more philosophical underpinning of all this in the material. Casey asks this fundamental question.
Is the state a necessary evil?
Right. How does he approach that?
Well, he starts by defining evil, which is interesting. The definition provided in the sources is pretty simple. Willful, destructive interference with other people's lives or property.
Okay, interference is key. And applying that to the state.
His conclusion, as presented, is stark. The state, by its very nature, is evil.
Because
Because its core functions, taxation, regulation, law enforcement, all rely on coercion, on interference. It inherently acts with other people's lives and property, which fits his definition.
that's a very strong stance. It challenges the whole idea of government for the common good.
Absolutely. And they use the famous trolley problem thought experiment to explore this.
The runaway trolley.
Yeah.
Pull the lever to save 5, but kill 1.
Usually, yeah, it's debated based on utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. But here, it's used differently.
How so?
The argument presented, tied to Casey's view, is that the guiding principle shouldn't be calculation, but justice defined as non-interference. Even if pulling the lever saves more lives, the act of willfully interfering to cause someone's death is, by this definition, the evil act. Justice trumps utility.
So the ends don't justify the means if the means involve coercion or interference.
That's the essence of the argument presented.
And the sources connect this philosophical definition to contemporary issues.
Yes, there's a critique mention suggesting that some modern movements, they name Black Lives Matter specifically,
Yeah.
are seen from this particular viewpoint as potentially weaponizing subjective ideas of justice, using group identity or historical grievances to justify action.
That involve interference with individual rights or property.
Exactly, which, according to the non-interference principle outlined, would be problematic. It's definitely a perspective that challenges mainstream narratives.
No kidding. And there's another quote that really sums up this whole philosophical part, isn't there?
Yes, politics and the state are evil because they act with other people's lives and property.
It really crystallizes why someone holding this view would advocate so strongly for separating oneself, financially and geographically, from state power.
It provides the why behind the what of Plan B.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The sources also covered some other, maybe more specific or quirky questions and analyses. What about this one on what the ultra-rich complain about?
Ah, yeah, the elite regrets point. It was an interesting detour. The question was put to Casey. What do people with immense wealth and power actually moan about?
And the answer wasn't what you'd expect.
Not really. According to the source, his answer was overwhelmingly regret.
Regret over what? Bad investments.
Apparently not. The perspective offered is that chasing wealth and power can be all-consuming distractions. Once people get there, the excuses vanish. They're left alone with themselves, confronting past choices, relationships, how they spent their lives.
So success doesn't shield you from existential angst.
Quite the opposite, it seems to suggest. It strips away the buffers. Wealth can't buy back time or fix fundamental character flaws, apparently.
That's
Yay.
quite profound, a sobering thought. And connected to that, there was a business insight.
Yes. Tied to this idea of what's truly valuable, the sources claim that at the highest levels, finding people who are genuinely reliable, ethical, and competent is incredibly difficult.
Really, you'd think competence would be table stakes at that level.
Apparently, combining all three, reliability, ethics, competence, is rare. So these elite individuals are constantly searching for trustworthy people who can act as force multipliers.
Force multipliers.
Yeah, people who can just get things done effectively and honestly, multiplying the principal's own efforts. Being that kind of person is presented as incredibly valuable, almost a superpower, because it's so scarce.
That's a really interesting take on personal value. Okay, totally different topic now. Using weird market indicators like silver versus sugar prices.
Right. Someone asked if there's insight to be gained from the ratio of silver to sugar.
And the verdict,
Pretty dismissive, actually. The response in the material is, no, there's no meaningful economic connection there.
unlike, say, gold to silver.
Exactly. Or corn to cattle. Those ratios make sense because the commodities are related substitutes, input costs, etc. Silver and sugar, not so much.
So looking at that ratio is just noise.
Likely speculative, maybe based on some historical coincidence or anecdote, but not a reliable indicator for market insight, according to these sources. Stick to relationships that make fundamental sense.
Good advice. Next up, Japan's abandoned houses. IKEA.
Yeah.
Investment opportunity or trap?
Trap, mostly, according to the analysis here.
Why? There are millions of them, right? Some must be cheap.
Cheap, yes, but the issue is demand. The analysis ties it directly to Japan's demographic collapse.
Population shrinking.
And aging, rapidly. It's happening elsewhere, too.
Yeah.
South Korea, China, Italy are mentioned. Fewer people overall and fewer young people wanting to live in remote rural areas.
So who's going to buy or rent these places?
Exactly. Without a major turnaround in population trends or huge investment in rural infrastructure, these houses are liabilities, not assets. You might buy one for almost nothing, but then you have taxes, upkeep, and no buyer when you want to sell.
They used an analogy for this, didn't they?
Yeah, China's ghost cities or empty skyscrapers. Just because a building exists doesn't give it value if there's no economic life or demand around it.
That paints a very clear picture. Okay, last specific topic. ASML, those crucial chip-making machines, and China.
Right. ASML, the Dutch company, makes the super advanced EUV machines needed for the best AI chips and so on. They have a near monopoly.
Vital technology. And the issue discussed is
Geopolitics, specifically U.S. export bans trying to stop China from getting this cutting-edge tech.
trying to slow down China's semiconductor ambitions?
That's the goal. But the analysis in the sources argues it might be backfiring.
How so?
By forcing China's hand. Instead of relying on ASML, China is now pouring massive resources into developing its own EUV-level technology domestically. The pressure from the ban is accelerating their innovation.
So the ban intended to hinder them is actually spurring them on.
That's the argument presented, that these kinds of tech bans can be self-defeating in the long run. They incentivize your competitor to become self-reliant and potentially even more innovative because they have to be. Necessity, mother of invention, and all that.
Wow. Unintended consequences on a massive scale. Okay, that covers a lot of ground. Let's try and pull the threads together. Based on this whole deep dive, what are the main takeaways for our listeners? What does it boil down to?
Well, I think the first big one is awareness. The material strongly suggests you should be aware that government overreach, especially concerning wealth held in regulated systems like pensions, is a rising risk. The base assumption presented is they will look for ways to access private wealth.
Okay, be aware. And that directly leads to the second point.
The importance of actively building that plan B, both legally and geographically.
Using things like corporations, maybe offshore.
Self-directed IRAs holding hard assets like gold or foreign real estate, diversifying away from single points of failure, maybe exploring second residency or citizenship. It's about building resilience.
And underpinning all that practical advice is the philosophical stance we discussed.
Right. the deep skepticism of state power. If you share that view, or even just hedge against it, then owning real, tangible assets that are hard to seize or control becomes a priority. Don't trust the state with your future, basically.
Then there was the more personal insight from the elite regrets discussion.
Yeah, that wealth alone isn't the answer. It won't solve deeper life questions or regrets. Building character, self-awareness, making good choices along the way, that's presented as maybe even more crucial than just financial success.
And finally, related to that, the idea that your own competence and integrity are incredibly valuable.
Perhaps your most valuable currency, in a world where finding truly reliable, ethical, capable people is apparently tough. Being that person makes you indispensable, a real force multiplier.
So lots to think about there. From practical financial strategy to deep philosophical questions about the role of the state and the nature of true value.
It definitely encourages a critical look at the systems we rely on and prompts you to think about building personal sovereignty on multiple levels.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone mulling over, building on these themes. If the sources are right, and relying solely on traditional state-linked systems for security carries growing risks, where does the ultimate responsibility for crafting a secure, meaningful future really lie?
That's certainly some food for thought.